A shovel struck stone and the sound rang like an accusation. The chronicler moved forward, fingers closing on the edge of the sheet, soiled satchel at his hip, and saw the mason pry away packed earth to reveal a carved sigil that glowed faintly beneath the dusk. Suspicion tightened his jaw. He reached down and felt a low vibration through the soil. "Stop," he said, his voice steady. "What is that?" The man with the hammer froze. "Aldrich," a mason called. "Keep the pit clear." Master Mason Aldrich wiped grit from his knuckles and knelt, eyes fixed on the symbol. He traced the groove with a calloused thumb and did not remove his hand. The chronicler watched the thumb tremble once, a concrete sign of reaction, and he thought, not yet, not without record. The suspicion that led him here now pushed him to document, to force logic into ritual. He turned an oil lamp higher and set his lamp on a wooden crate. Within 5 sentences he had identified the problem. The foundation held an inscription, and the inscription was active. That is why he had come. The town council had authorized the cathedral and given money. They had not been told why men worked at night, roping off the pit. The chronicler, whose life had been spent cataloguing charters and marginalia, had learned to read plain omissions. He stepped closer and smelled wet lime and blood, sweat from the masons. "Aldrich," he said, "say what you know." His tone implied order, not accusation, and that moved people to answer. Aldrich kept his thumb on the sigil. "We found this while digging the footing. It is carved under the coffering. It is old, it glows when the lamp breathes on it." He looked at the chronicler. "Brother Marcellus us to stop and not tell the town. He says it is a foundation prayer." The chronicler watched Aldrich's jaw set and understood that secrecy had weight here. The chronicler's hands tightened around the satchel strap. He had studied notation of seals in monastery folios. He had seen rubbings of concentric geometry before. That knowledge made the proffered explanation inadequate. "Let me see the pattern." He moved to kneel, his coat brushing mortar dust. As he unrolled a small folded folio, his spectacles slid down his nose and he adjusted them. The gesture was deliberate. It had a tone that told others he meant to record and not to accuse without cause. The first emotion that pushed him into action was suspicion, and that suspicion became the engine of every question he would ask. Brother Marcellus arrived with 2 candles and the kind of silence courtiers call restraint. He kept his hands folded beneath his cloak and did not kneel. "Chronicler," he said, naming him the way men measure rank, "this is a private matter." The bishop commanded discretion. "Then show the bishop's command," the chronicler replied. He unrolled a strip of parchment and set it by the pit. "If this is a prayer, it belongs in the chapter house archive, not under an altar without record." Marcellus's face hardened. "You will cause fear, man. The townsfolk do not need such tales. They do not need lies, either." The chronicler. The words were short. The exchange pushed the gathering toward a decision, secrecy or truth. The chronicler's suspicion shifted subtly here into moral outrage. He could not abide concealment where danger showed signs. They argued in short lines of speech, voices rising and falling in workable human patterns. "Who carved it?" Aldrich demanded. "When?" The chronicler. Marcellus replied with evasions. "Old hands. Earlier builders. We were told not to pry." Architect Soren arrived after the argument, as if drawn by the voices. He had a blunt nose and a habit of rubbing the bridge of his hand when nervous. He unrolled, reluctantly, a thin plan from beneath his cloak. The chronicler watched Soren's hands. He noticed the trimmer in Soren's fingertips as the architect spread the paper. That trimmer carried information. Hands that shook hid a different truth than faces that set jawlines. Soren whispered, "These are the original instructions." They were buried in a merchant chest beneath the nave. Only Marcellus held the key, the chronicler for the chest, and Soren led him toward the nave, motioning for quiet. They reached a hidden doorway behind an old tapestry. Soren's fingers brushed the wooden latch and the hinges complained. The chest inside contained vellum and charcoal rubbings. The chronicler lifted a page and read discreet, technical notes. Concentric circles, precise measurements of keystone pressure, margin notes that referenced blood offerings and obligations of the parish every 3rd year. The chronicler read the line aloud. "Offerings to maintain the seal, He did not raise his voice. He let the words fall like the strike of a rule. It prescribes human labor and payments. It names families. Soren put a hand to his mouth. It is not what we were told. It is older than the bishopric. It was written by the Masons who first agreed to the work. They set terms. They promised. Soren stopped, as if the sentence itself might free whatever the sigil held. A cold clarity replaced the chronicler's initial outrage. The chronology in the pages made the matter not symbolic but costly. The ritual had fiscal requirements and coercive obligations encoded into the masonry. That realization moved the chronicler from suspicion into a quiet calculation. He began to catalogue names, to plan who would be asked, and how the evidence would appear in his folio. He made a note to reference parish rolls at dawn. Night deepened. The chapter house smelled of tallow and old ink. The Masons had to finish a binding attempt before the mortar set. Marcellus organized a nocturnal rite beneath the nave. The description on the vellum called for a veiled reliquary set within the outermost ring. The chronicler watched the ritual unfold from the stairwell, lamp lowered so his face remained in shadow. He kept his breathing even and counted the steps of the ceremony. The Masons carried the reliquary in a crate. Guild watchman Thomas stood by the entrance, hand on his halberd, listening. Aldrich stood closest to the pit and guided the crate. His knuckles were white. The chronicler recorded the sequence. 14 men in 2 lines, the reliquary placed at the center, Marcellus intoning a line from the rubrics, and Soren overseeing the alignment of the stones. They laid the reliquary on the sigil and began the first seal, thrust with iron tongs. The stone resisted. A mason, young and broad-shouldered, hived and then flew backward as if pulled by an unseen hand. He hit the wall and crumpled. He did not speak. Men rushed toward him, feeling for pulse. The chronicler took off his spectacles and wiped the lenses, hands shaking. He moved down the stair and touched the mason's wrist. It was cold and pulseless for a moment before a ragged beat returned. The mason's eyes opened and he gasped. He did not remember falling. He pressed a hand to his chest and then to the stone, and the skin at his wrist showed a shallow burn. What happened? Aldrich demanded. The mason said nothing that explained the force that threw the man. Thomas checked the crate and braced the reliquary. Soren cursed between clipped breaths. The chronicler wrote the occurrence in his folio with precise times. The event forced a new emotional change. Vague calculation turned to fear. The chronicler felt fear as a physical pressure behind his sternum. He told himself to record an act, to place the event into a chain of facts. Marcellus began a counter, a short string of prayers and hand movements drawn from the margins of the chest. He ordered the masons to hold the keystone steady. The masons obeyed. The reliquary slowly settled into the ring. For a long measure the only sound was the scratch of pen on vellum. The chronicler recorded the wording of Marcellus' phrase. At dawn the reliquary sat sealed but not whole. A hairline fracture marked the reliquary's copper lid. One mason, the young man who had been thrown, was missing from his bedroll at the guild house. The bell for matins began before anyone could speak. Men moved like those who hold a secret together. The chronicler sat at a narrow desk and made an entry. He paused at the line where he had to describe the missing mason. He dipped his pen and wrote the man's name. He felt the ink tremble slightly. Soren came to the scriptorium and shut the door. He kept his voice low. "I did it," he said. The words without flourish. The chronicler did not raise his head at once. "You tried to loosen the keystone?" he asked. Soren admitted it with a nod. "Why?" The chronicler, "Because this is wrong. Soren, we built houses and bridges. We built a cage here." He put his palm on the plan laid open on the table and pushed. "They us when they needed laborers. They families their children would be safe. They them these seals were prayers. I saw the ledger. They named the poor to bind the thing. I could not bear it. I had my hand on the keystone and I thought, I will free the man they used for this obligation. You touched the keystone while the reliquary was set," the chronicler demanded. His voice did not rise but moved like a sharpened instrument. Soren met his gaze. "Yes. I thought I could shift it enough to ease the strain. I meant only to loosen, to let them revisit the terms. I did not expect the pulse, the pressure, Aldrich banged a fist on the table. You jeopardized us all. You let it breathe. Did you not feel the weight? His words were rapid, clipped. The argument turned into a short, fierce back and forth. Aldrich, Soren began. You are reckless. Aldrich shot back. They are the ones who forced our hands, Soren. The exchange lasted 5 lines and then snapped. Thomas leaned forward and whispered, "What of the missing Mason?" Soren's face went taut. I cannot find him. I saw only a movement of air and light. He did not fall. He vanished from the ring as if the stone took him. That revelation changed the problem's center. A missing man meant the obligation had been enforced in a manner beyond bookkeeping. The chronicler felt anger sharpen into resolve. He closed the folio and decided to cross the ledger against parish rolls immediately. He would name those who were bound. He would not yet expose the Brotherhood's purpose to the town without corroboration. But he would not remain passive. He sent 2 notes at once, one to the guild house and one to a woman named Inez who kept the parish rolls. He wrote with clean strokes to make the message look routine. The messages read like any other request, but their aim was to bring names to light. While he waited for replies, he confronted Brother Marcellus again in the chapter house. The argument now had 3 voices: Brother Marcellus, the chronicler. The ledger names parish families for offerings. Which families? Marcellus closed his eyes and then opened them slowly. Some are poor. Some will not resist. It is the ancient compact. He did not give names. Soren pulled a small scrap of parchment from his sleeve and held it out. "I have the list," he said. "But I am not giving it to you to use as blackmail. I am giving it to you because I cannot undo what we did." The chronicler accepted the list with a measured nod. He felt the shards of emotion move inside him. Suspicion to outrage to fear to a cold, disciplined resolve. Each shift showed in his posture. He placed the list in his satchel and left with Aldrich and Thomas to cross the rolls. They walked through streets where shutters were closed and dogs slept in wooden crates. Aldrich kept saying the missing Mason's name aloud, testing how each syllable sounded in the town's air. "Jonan," he said. "His wife sues for the guild house. They had a child last spring." Aldrich added facts in short lines. He organized recollection into material data. The chronicler checked the parish ledger with Inez and found the name with an entry that matched the ledger's notation. Years of service, annual payment, a clause signed with a crooked mark. The ledger's clause read like a contract. Maintain the seal. Provide labor or surrender names as due. The chronicler copied it word for word and then set the folio aside. He watched his own hands. They were steady. He felt dread as a physical tightening in his forearms. He forced himself to breathe through it and to plan. That afternoon, Soren confessed a second fact. He had found a marginal note in the original Mason's charter. The note named a brotherhood that tended the seals and promised secrecy across 3 generations. They call themselves the Keepers. Soren. They met in the crypt and pledged to guard the reliquary. The bishop was not of their name. The bishop was chosen later. The chronicler listened and then asked the question that cut clean. Who sits on that brotherhood now? Soren looked at the chronicler and then away. Marcellus sits on it. Aldrich was inducted. Thomas keeps watch. There are others among the Masons and the clergy. It is not an order of saints. It is an order of custodians. The discovery reversed priorities. Where earlier the chronicler had suspected a clandestine ritual, he now faced the evidence of organized, institutional maintenance. The emotional movement was precise. Suspicion gave way to moral outrage, fear, and then a strategic coldness because the problem required a record, not a sermon. He decided to place the ledger under his care, to inventory every obligation, and to catalogue each named family so that if the seal failed again, he could trace responsibility. Night returned. The men prepared for a second binding attempt under the nave. Soren he would watch but not touch. The chronicler followed with pen and lamp. The reliquary lay in the ring, hairline fracture like a wound. Marcellus stood with hands raised and spoke lines that sounded older than the cathedral. The chorus of Masons echoed the movement of the prayer. The chronicler recorded each motion, each hand sign, and the exact placement of the keystone. Then Soren moved with his hand hidden beneath his cloak. He slipped a small wedge against the keystone and tried to shift it. The wedge summoned the same pulse the first time, only louder. The floor beneath them vibrated like an answered bell. Light poured from the fracture in the reliquary and then pooled into a pale pressure that pressed against the soles of their shoes. Aldrich lunged and pushed Soren aside. "Stop," he barked. Their hands met on the wedge. Soren's knuckles whitened. Thomas struck the wedge with his palm and tore it from Soren's grasp. For a long breath the stone moved a fraction of an inch. The reliquary cracked wider and something like a thin, cold wind hissed from the seam. The chronicler grabbed the ledger and forced his pen to record the exact wording Marcellus intoned, while Marcellus moved with desperate precision. The line of words was shorter this time, chosen to pull the fracture closed. The chamber shook and a sound like metal against metal issued from the reliquary. Aldrich and Soren both pushed until their shoulders burned. Thomas braced the wooden trestles. The chronicler placed one palm against the stone to steady himself and felt something like a needle press along his skin. When Marcellus finished the phrase, the reliquary popped and the crack snapped closed. Silence arrived in a physical way. Men breathed loudly, shoulders loose, sweat running into their beards. The missing mason remained missing. The reliquary's lid no longer fit cleanly. A thin line remained visible. Soren collapsed against the wall and sobbed in breaths that cut. Aldrich sat and pressed his forehead to his palms. Thomas stood with his halberd lowered, eyes fixed on the closed ring. The chronicler opened his folio and made an entry with tight script. He outlined the damage, timed the ritual, named those present. He noted a strange mark forming on his own palm where the reliquary's return had brushed him. A faint crescent he could not explain. He touched the mark and felt a slight sting, a direct physical reaction that linked him to the event. He had crossed two major thresholds. He had seen the ledger that proved coercion, and he had felt a physical sign of the reliquary's influence. Those facts formed a twist that changed the tale. The cathedral was not merely a contract of status, but a mechanism that could claim flesh. That truth made the chronicler understand why secrecy had been paramount. In the final hours before dawn, the chapter met to decide. The men spoke in practical terms. Mend the reliquary, continue the watch, conceal the ledger. Soren begged for the keystone to be removed, for the compact to be broken. Aldrich reminded the room of the townsfolk's fear if names surfaced. Marcellus argued the costs of failing the seal. Voices moved through 3 to 6 rapid exchanges at points, each line short and urgent. The chronicler listened and then spoke. "We have a missing man," he said. "We have a ledger that names the poor. We have a fracture that will grow if it is left to time. We will not tell the town in panic. But we will record every fact and bind the ledger within the chapter house with clear warning. I will keep the record and make a copy for the families named. If the seal breaks again, the responsibility will be visible." Marcellus swallowed, "and the brotherhood. Thomas will check the roster each week. Aldrich, Soren will help repair the reliquary. We will keep watch and we will not use parish labor without consent." The decision was not unanimous. Soren refused to promise silence. He left the chapter house and did not return to his bed. The chronicler thought his departure an intentional fracture. He also thought it a necessary break in a chain of complicity. Dawn broke through a narrow slit in the nave. It fell on a single cracked sigil in the floor, illuminating the symbol in hard, clean light. The chronicler placed his folio into a hidden compartment beneath his table, and then buried the ledger's copy in a wrapped bundle beneath a loose stone in the scriptorium. He lit a candle and left a single line on the folio's margin. Warning, do not unseal without witness. Then he locked the folio in a chest and set the key inside his satchel. Before he left the nave, he knelt and pressed his palm against the cracked sigil. The mark on his hand pulsed once and then settled. He rose and closed the door behind him. Men lingered to speak in low voices, and one by one they departed. Aldrich walked to the guild house. Thomas returned to his watch. Marcellus stayed and folded his hands over his chest. The chronicler walked through the market with his lamp slung low. He felt the weight of record in his satchel like a living thing. He had moved from suspicion to action, from outrage to careful preservation, and now to a resolve so measured it felt like a cold plan. He had found proof that the cathedral had been built to contain something, and that the containment had a price. As he reached the scriptorium door, he turned back and looked once at the cathedral's silhouette against the pale sky. A mason's boy ran from a stable laughing. A bell tolled. The chronicler placed his hand on the door, felt the wood's grain, and then moved inside to close his desk. He began to write the night's events in full, line by line, leaving marginal notes addressed to later readers. He did not sign his name. He did not add moral judgment. He described actions. The discovery in the pit, Soren's submission, the missing mason, the fracture, the counter, right, the ledger clause, and the decisions taken. The final paragraph of his entry tied to a concrete action. He wrote, "At dawn the seal sits. The reliquary is cracked. A man is missing. I hide a copy of the ledger beneath the scriptorium's loose stone and give a key to no one." He closed the folio, placed the candle stub into an iron holder, and pushed the folio under a shelf. The candle guttered, the smoke curled into the rafters. Outside, Brother Marcellus came to the scriptorium, set down a small bowl of water, and said, "We will tend the seals." The chronicler answered with a short, measured nod. And then he carried his lamp out into a street that held more questions than answers. The chapter ended on the concrete beat of his action. He had hidden the ledger and left the cracked sigil uncovered for the town to find later if the Brotherhood failed. A chisel tore a shallow arc across dressed stone and the capstone moved an inch. Work halted on the scaffolding as men froze with muzzled curses. "Stop!" Prior Marox shouted from below. Suspicion tightened the chronicler's jaw as he climbed the ladder 3 rungs at a time and looked down into the gap where mortar had split. The immediate problem was visible. A carved capstone with an inner lip had shifted and a weak ring of light showed beneath the joint. The chronicler understood the stakes in concrete terms. If the seal failed, pressure would expand through the masonry, and whatever the Brotherhood contained could press outward. The chronicler smelled wet lime and the iron of a mason's blood blister. He had seen a similar sigil unearthed at dusk weeks before. A mason had pried back packed earth and revealed a carved mark that glowed faintly beneath the dirt. That earlier discovery had settled like a pebble in his pocket ever since. Now, on the nave scaffolding, Henrik's hands trembled while he tried to steady the capstone. Henrik's breath came fast. "Henrik," the chronicler, climbing to the work platform, "what did you find beneath the hood?" Henrik's voice scraped. "A hairline crack runs into the ring, chronicler. The capstone gave twice when I set the chisel." I felt a cold sink. The chronicler's suspicion shifted into alarm when he pressed a finger to the carved groove and felt a faint vibration under his fingertip. He did not name the feeling. He squared his shoulders and looked for evidence. He had come to observe the cathedral's structure, not to be a laborer, but the cathedral's failing parts now demanded action. The prior's fleece cloak brushed the scaffold rope as he climbed. "Prior Marox, the chronicler, we cannot leave that unset." "Show me the joint." The prior's face was a mask of compressed lines. They moved like a single small machine. Henrik levering the edge, Brother Eudes holding a lantern, the chronicler kneeling to peer at the sigil's edge. Light slipped into the crack and revealed tool marks older than the current mason's work. Someone had worked on that seal before the present repairs. The chronicler felt his suspicion harden into a quiet conviction and then into a new, sharper emotion that made him work faster. Protective caution. He watched Henrik trace the fracture with a gloved thumb. "Is this recent?" The chronicler. Henrik looked at Brother Eudes. "No, sir." Fresh scoring. Whoever opened it used a thin blade and then smoothed the groove. "The mortar's been tamped in the last month." Brother Eudes' hand tightened on the lantern. He lowered his voice. "We have kept watch. Still, someone forced a seam. We only the Brotherhood." An outsider's threat shifted the room's tone. The chronicler made a quick choice. He would follow the trail of tampering before words filled the cloister. He slid down the ladder and moved through the nave to the sacristy, where the prior signaled for secrecy. The prior's bargain would be offered later, the chronicler sensed. For now he needed to catalogue damage and find evidence of the tampering he smelled in the stone and felt in the tightened hands around him. In the sacristy, Henrik pulled a cloth-wrapped fragment from his satchel and laid it on the table. The fragment was a sliver of braided mortar and a curl of lead pinning an old seal. The chronicler set his spectacles and leaned in until the rim pressed his brow. He kept his voice flat. "Where did you get this, Henrik?" Henrik avoided his eyes from beneath a lower stare. "Brother Eudes and I cut a hole and found moisture in that pin. We tamped it and covered it with ash to hide the work." Brother Eudes' jaw worked. "We did not call the prior at once because the Mason crew feared alarm. We feared drawing harvesters and patrons." The chronicler felt a new emotion shift. His protective caution bent toward distrust. He suspected concealment within the brotherhood. He put his palm on the lead and felt tiny pitting where acid had touched it. He took out folded notes and recorded Henrik's scraped words with steady strokes. Concrete details only: place, time, tool marks, presence of moisture. He avoided speculation on motive while his pen moved to record fact. Outside, bells did not toll. In the cloister courtyard, stones were slick with condensation. A visitor arrived before dawn, a procurator named Valerian, whose forged orders and silver coin would soon test the cloister's resolve. The chronicler watched Valerian enter under umbrella and cloak, watched the man show a letter with a trembling seal. Valerian spoke first when the prior refused entry. "Prior Malrux, I carry a mandate from the chapter house at the Archbishop's court. I require access to the reliquary beneath your nave." Valerian's words had the thin, practiced cadence of a man who expected doors to open on command. Prior Malrux's shoulders tightened. "Valerian, you will not move past the cloister unaided. The cathedral is under private maintenance. We grant only essential visitation." Valerian smiled with a mouth that did not reach his eyes. "Essential for my patron. Keep the brotherhood's peace, and you will be rewarded." The chronicler watched Henrik's fingers clench around a stone window mullion. Isolde the acolyte hovered at the archway, her breath shallow in the cold. The chronicler felt alarm again, and then a measured anger at the intrusion. He stepped forward. "Valerian," he said, "the reliquary is not for sale. Present your orders to the chapter, and we will examine them." Valerian tilted his head. "The chapter will not be pleased if the reliquary sits uninspected. The Archbishop insists on verification." A short argument followed. "Henrik, we will not open the seal for toadying patrons," Valerian snapped. "You are not the court." "Henrik," 3 lines of quick retort traveled between them. Prior Malrux intervened with a terse command and ended the exchange. The chronicler recorded each spoken line in his ledger, noting the rapid back and forth and the way voices tightened. Dialogue revealed alliances. Henrik siding with the Brotherhood's craft, Valerian pressing the court's influence, and Malrux balancing secrecy and external pressure. The chronicler to inspect the crypt himself. He would not leave this moment to politics. He descended with Isolde, who carried the lamp, and the smell of damp stone closed around them. The descent was a deliberate action. Step, hand on cold handrail, breath held, lamp swung to reveal the carved stair. The crypt showed fresh tool marks where someone had forced a seam. Moisture had bled into the mortar, leaving dark streaks like runnels down the stone. The chronicler bent and felt the seam with his knuckles. It gave a soft, hollow reply. "Isolde, I saw tracks in the dust. Someone came through the service tunnel before dawn, tracks from boots or from a rope." The chronicler boots. Mud at the heel, a deep print toward the reliquary. The chronicler's suspicion widened into a need to act. He catalogued the prints, measured stride with inked string, and tied a thin length of twine around a fallen tool to mark its position. The crypt's air pressed cold against his face. His hands trembled while he worked. He wrote fast in a small hand: tools, small chisel, slotted key, iron pin, print single set leading from tunnel, moisture. Recent. He did not name the intruder. For now he recorded the material clues and let them lead him. When they returned to the chapter house, the prior requested a private conference. Malrux's offer was blunt. He spoke in a low voice to the chronicler in the private room and closed the shutter against dawn. "We will perform the archaic sealing rite. The prior, in exchange." You keep our silence on the tampering. We need the Brotherhood intact to tend the seals. The chronicler felt his earlier distrust become an internal battle. He placed both palms on the table and leaned forward. Prior Marak's secrecy buys time, but it also asks me to become complicit. I have records. I do not give them lightly. Brother Yudes stood near the door. He had a habit of folding his hands over his chest when nervous. His fingers tapped once and then twice. Yudes, the chronicler, explain why the Brotherhood has delayed reporting this. Yudes' voice came out rough. We feared the crowds. We feared archbishops and procurators. We feared men who would pry with coin. We feared an order that would open the reliquary for profit. The Brotherhood agreed to keep watch rather than tell the chapter and start a public panic. The chronicler listened and felt his emotion shift from distrust to a grudging comprehension. The Brotherhood's secrecy was not simple selfishness. It was a defensive choice to prevent exploitation. He could not fully trust them, but he understood the motive. He also understood the moral cost. He weighed his next move: accept the prior's right and silence, or refuse and risk the procurator forcing entry. He did not speak immediately. He traced a sigil on the table with his fingertip and felt the scratch of ink under his nail. Before he could answer, Valerian struck again. He moved through the cloister with a pair of men carrying a chained case. The procurator's people forced a second confrontation in the courtyard. Valerian held the forged order high and demanded access by force if necessary. Open the vault, Morox. I bring the archbishop's agents. I will not leave without inspection. Morox's reply was a short command to his brothers to hold the gate. The courtyard became a new battlefield. Men jostled. Henrik pushed forward to lock the iron ring on the outer door. Isolde frantically tied down a loose hinge. The chronicler stepped between Valerian and the gate with his ledger raised like proof. Valerian, the records show irregular tampering. I will not permit entry without a full examination and without witnesses of proper authority. Valerian sneered. Your records are not enough. You will break your seals for my patron, or you will answer to the court. The chronicler's anger hardened into a decision. He turned to Henrik and said, prepare the temporary seal. We will attempt a field patch and perform a simple rite to buy time. Henrik's hands moved with purpose. Henrik, bring lead, ash, and the iron clamp. Isolde, fetch wax and the small bell. Yudes, stand with the lantern. They worked on the crypt altar and the adjacent service tunnel. The chronicler recited measured phrases from the codex while he and Henrik tamped powdered mortar into the seam. Isolde told a small bell at the chronicler's direction. The bell's ring was clipped and precise. They bound a crude lead plate with iron straps and poured hot wax over the join. For a moment the stone hummed under the chronicler's palm, and the air smelled of scorched wax and wet lime. Isolde reeled and put a hand to her mouth. Her face went pale and she swayed. My head, she said. I see. And then she stopped, eyes widening as if she had glimpsed something at the edge of the light. Her knees bent and she grabbed a bench to steady herself. The chronicler felt a wave of fear wash through his chest at Isolde's collapse. He set the brass compass on the stone beside him and felt the metal warm under his palm. He had kept the compass in his satchel since the earlier encounter in the foundation. Now the compass ring tingled, and he knew it no longer behaved like a normal instrument. The chronicler made a fast choice. He fitted the compass ring over the fresh seal, aligning its broken sigil with the carved groove, and hammered the iron clamp into place. The ring resisted and then snapped into a faint fit. Valerian forced men into the passage and a scuffle erupted beneath the nave. The seal cracked with a dry pop, and a pressure shivered outward like wind through reeds. Henrik shouted, "Hold!" The chronicler pushed his hand down on the compass ring and felt a lancing cold bite into his skin. His fingers stung. A dark smear crawled across the webbing of his hand where the ring met flesh. He tasted metal on his tongue. For a second the room filled with a low, mechanical grinding. The chronicler made a single physical sacrifice. He twisted the brass compass and snapped its inner plate to realign the etched sigils. The compass bit and then the grinding stilled. Valerian cursed and was shoved back by Brother Yudes. The chronicler looked at his hand and saw a bruise of red that had a thin, dark, curling line beneath the skin. He wrapped his hand in a scrap of linen and tied it with twine. The immediate breach had stopped. The temporary patch held. Valerian withdrew with his men, but not without threats. He left a note on the chapter house table demanding access and promising a return. The chronicler catalogued the wound on his hand with a steady stroke in the ledger and recorded the cracked seal's position on the nave floor. He added a brief line: compass fragment used as alignment tool, result partial success. Physical corruption noted. He did not yet know the long-term cost of that corruption. At dawn the cathedral was quiet and altered. The seal lay cracked and a fine dust rimmed the impression in the floor. The procurator had gone, but the Brotherhood had rearranged their watch and tightened their patrols. Prior Maurox walked the nave with slow steps and folded hands, telling the men to increase the sentry rotations and to check for dampness at every seam. Henrik did as he was told and hammered shallow wedges into the scaffolding joints. Isolde sat on a stair and held her head with both hands. She did not speak much, but when she did her sentences came clipped. I saw a shape, Isolde, voice low, not a face. A pressure like someone leaning on a bone. It tasted like cold iron. Henrik looked at the chronicler. We have kept this hidden to hold the line, chronicler. The Brotherhood cannot let gold pry these things open. The chronicler considered their words and felt his final emotional shift of the chapter. From protective caution and distrust into a worried allegiance. He would not endorse secrecy blindly, but he would not let external men tear the reliquary open without witnesses and safeguards. He had seen the seal crack and felt the sting on his hand. He had seen Valerian push for access. He set down a final decision in his ledger. He would prepare a written warning to be sent beyond the cloister, but he would allow the Brotherhood one controlled right to attempt to restore the seal under his written conditions. He wrote the conditions with exact clarity. Witnesses named, materials listed, no one outside the chapter to stand nearer than the outer gate, and a full record to be sealed in the archive. He gave the note to Brother Eudes with a pinched nod and told him to carry it to the town post at first light. The chronicler then placed the cracked seal fragment in his satchel next to the brass compass shard and closed it tight. Before he left, he catalogued the physical evidence again. He numbered the tool marks and set them in order. He recorded Isolde's faint vertigo and Henrik's admission of clandestine repairs. He recorded Valerian's forged order and the procurator's threats. He did not embellish, he wrote, instead with the clincher, what to do next. He would not give the Brotherhood total cover. He set conditions, recorded their bargain, and prepared to send his ledger beyond the cloister walls. At the chapter house door the chronicler paused. The prior watched him. Brother Eudes waited at a respectful distance. Henrik shook lime dust from his hands. Isolde held the little bell she had rung during the attempted patch and kept it closed like a talisman. The chronicler tightened the strap on his satchel. He felt the sting on his hand again, and the bruise warmed beneath the linen. He tasted wax and iron, and the shadow of the seal hung in his thoughts like an unfinished equation. He stepped into the cloister light, carrying the ledger and the fragment. Maurox's one sentence as the door closed behind them. Do not write of our full rights unless you must. The chronicler's last action in the chapter was precise and physical. He set the cracked seal piece on top of his folded note, folded the paper over it, and pressed the pad of his thumb against the fold. He then tucked the packet into the satchel alongside the compass fragment. He left the chapter house and moved toward the path that led beyond the cloister, intending to post his warning at the town office before Valerian could return. The day smelled of lime and rumpled dust. The Brotherhood intensified their watch. The prior posted 2 men at each entrance. The chronicler walked away with a ledger heavier by facts and lighter by the weight of silence he had accepted for now. The chapter resolved its immediate conflict. The breach had been halted, the Brotherhood had kept the secret for protection, and the procurator had retreated for the moment. The chronicler had witnessed a bargain and had accepted conditions he did not fully trust. He had paid a price with his own flesh to stop the worst of the breach. He would send the record beyond the cloister. He would not remain a silent scribe forever. As he reached the outer gate, the chronicler felt a small, cold click from inside his satchel where the compass fragment lay. He did not speak, but he paused and tightened his grip on the strap. He had postponed the larger confrontation. He had set his warning into motion. The note would travel to the town clerk. The Brotherhood would perform their archaic sealing rite at midnight under the prior's supervision. His hand throbbed where the brass had touched it, and the linen around his fingers had a darker seam than before. He walked out into the courtyard toward the path, his ledger closed, the cracked seal folded in paper, and the smell of wet lime following him like a repeated footstep. The lantern clattered across the flagstones and slid beneath the sacristy bench. Sister Lyora swore and shoved the lamp with her foot until it stilled. Her palm trembled when she pressed the iron rim, and a hairline fissure showed itself across the circular floor, sealed beneath the altar. Suspicion tightened the chronicler's jaw the way a hand might grip a throat. He stepped forward and put a fingertip to the cold stone where oily light leaked through the crack. The immediate problem was simple and concrete. The seal was breaking, and whatever the builders had bound beneath the floor might find a way out. He had read the ledger's cautions 3 nights earlier in the chapter house, but reading a warning and seeing a physical fracture were different acts. The chronicler's body moved before his reasoning settled. He crouched, the leather of his satchel rasping against his thigh, and traced the hairline with the pad of his finger until the stone was damp under his nail. He tasted metal at the back of his tongue and heard Prior Marorok's call from the nave that no alarm should leave the cloister. Suspicion, then urgency, reoriented his hands. He lifted the lamp and examined the sigil's edge for fresh chisel marks. Sister Lyra blinked blood from her lashes. "Father, the light," she began, voice low. She used his title to force formality into panic. "The chronicler, bring Edrin." Now his sentence was short. He did not look at her as if to soothe. He named action. The concrete stakes were obvious in the circle of faces. Stones were intended to hold. When stone fails, bodies answer for that failure. They did not move as a crowd. Master Mason Edrin arrived in 5 measured minutes with a coil of rope over his shoulder and a chisel at his belt. He knelt beside the fissure and tapped the edge with the hammer's head. The metallic sound echoed and filled the sacristy in a way that made Lucian, the custodian, flinch. Edrin's hand was steady. The hammer made no more than a soft, flat report. He frowned. "Settling," he said, "or a hairline fracture from weather." He did not say the word the chronicler felt, failing containment. Prior Marorox pushed through the door and closed it behind him. He carried the posture of a man who had learned to keep fear private. "No bell," he said. "We do not name the pit tonight." His voice held authority and a tight refusal. "We bury what can be kept, and we pray privately." His refusal created immediate division. The chronicler, the ledger contradicts rumor. The seal requires tending, not prayer alone. He felt the ledger's paper under his palm as if it were a second instrument, fragile, detailed, and full of obligations. Suspicion bent toward accusation in the chronicler's mind. He suspected the Brotherhood had been concealing more than ritual detail. Edrin tapped again. "This is not mortar. This runs along the carved ring." "Look," he ran a thumb along a groove, and the interior wash of the sigil glowed a colder blue, as if the stone accepted the tracing. Brother Halv muttered that the masonry had aged, and that nothing would leak beyond the crypt. Prior Marrox answered, "Then mend it quietly. We will not frighten the town with tales that belong to the founders." His refusal was not calm. It was a decision to manage risk through secrecy. The chronicler closed his hand around the satchel strap until the leather creaked. He had traveled the region to record foundations and vows. He knew how oaths hardened into systems that outlived their makers. He thought of the first chapter's discovery, a mason prying away packed earth to reveal a carved sigil that glowed beneath dusk. He thought of the second chapter's arc when a chisel tore stone and the capstone moved. Those earlier events were not mere portents. They were repeating points on a map. We must consult the ledger. Maurok's jaw tightened so visibly that Edrin, if the ledger says feed the seal, then feed the seal. But we cannot bind the whole town in this. The argument rearranged who would decide whether knowledge or containment carried weight. They took the ledger into the chapter house 2 hours later under oil lamps that left the margins deeper and the handwriting harder to read. Sister Lyra escorted the chronicler. When she held the folio, her fingers left a pale print. She had a way of breaking ritual quiet with precise concern. You found it where? She asked. Her voice was clipped to keep the question from expanding into alarm. Behind a shelf that had a false back, the chronicler. Between the Chronicles of Harvest and the Ledger of Bells, he placed the ringed key on the table and opened the page where the ink had been scraped away. The ledger smelled of water, iron, and old glue. The script had instructions that forced short breaths from both of them. The seal must be fed with blood, line, or memory. The founder's oath binds descendants in service. The stone drinks names. The chronicler pointed at a diagram in which a broken ring matched his own silver band. This matches my ring. He did not ask Sister Lyra to explain the oddity. He reported as evidence and felt a new shift, suspicion sliding into responsibility. Sister Lyra read the line aloud with a steady, practiced voice. Where the sigil slips, the living must offer line or token. She stopped and looked up. Line, she said, means descent. Token means artifact. The ledger used exact terms that left the chronicler no room for metaphor. A living cost was required. This choice forced a human shape upon the problem. He felt anger at the ledger's demand, the anger of someone who sees a system extracting lives in the name of order. If our ring matches, then my object binds to that clause. I did not know its origin. The words fell flat in the wooden room. They demanded a decision. They returned to the cloister where more men were gathered. Voices raised. Brother Halv demanded the town know. Prior Marox insisted on secrecy. Edrin argued for masonry remedies and public reinforcement. The chronicler placed the ledger on the stone table and opened it to a page scored with ledger ink and a faint smear of blood. We have a living clause, he said. It demands lineage or a bound artifact. My ring matches the diagram. Either someone provides kin, or we offer this. The room stilled for a breath and then split. The argument became sharp and rapid. We will not hand over blood for stone. Halv, chin up. Brother Halv, you will not decree the death of innocents. Marox snapped. Prior. Think, Edrin interjected. Master Edrin, stop. Stop arguing in riddles. The chronicler watched the exchange as if cataloguing each sinew of anger. Voices rose and fell in short bursts. 3 minutes of back and forth can contain the essential fractures. Secrecy versus confession, masonry versus ritual, life versus security. That argument produced the first external choice. A vote. The Brotherhood voted by counted hands in the cloister. The outcome favored containment with secrecy. They would not call the town. They voted to enact a midnight rite as the ledger allowed. Either present a blood, relative of the founders, or an artifact bound to the founder's sigil. When the tally fell in favor of the latter, the chronicler felt another motion through him, dread replacing anger. Dread showed in his fingers tightening on the ledger's edge. Then I offer my ring, he said. His voice was low and precise. It matches the diagram. Marox's face closed. Then, after a pause long enough to measure consequence, he said, we will test the fit. If it works, the seal will mend. If not, we decide again. Their choice narrowed action into a path toward the crypt. They prepared in silence. The Brotherhood cloaked themselves. Edrin carried a length of chain and a small iron key. Brother Halv bore a censer and the smell of coal. Sister Lyra tightened her hood and kept glancing at the chronicler as if to verify the ring remained his. The chronicler felt responsibility acute in his bones. He could not push this off onto the town. His hands were steady as he placed the ring in an inscribed leather pouch and chained the pouch to his satchel strap. He walked with the group across the shadowed nave, past stained glass that threw sharp bars of color over the flagstones, and down the stairs into the crypt. The main crypt lay beneath the nave, vaulted ribs pressed low. The fissurous cold light blurred up through the ring, sigil in the floor like oil seeping through cloth. Cloaked figures took places in a circle. The chronicler stood and felt his pulse in the soft, restrained way of someone holding back a tide. He set the inscribed key, a small iron rod with notches matching the ledger's diagram, into the crack. He felt the ring hum against his palm as if metal remembered another metal. The ledger's terms required a performed liturgy. Marrox intoned lines that were not church Latin but something older, clipped and ordered. The seal answered. The fissure widened with a sound like a long, wet breath. A coldness rose from the stone and touched faces. Several of the brotherhood shivered and tightened their mantles. The chronicler heard a dry noise in his teeth, the grit of sand shifting. Edrin struck the key with a mallet until light flared around the notches. The seal reacted as if inhaling. The brotherhood pushed their wills against that intake, their words, their offerings. The ring pressed into stone, and the confrontation became violent in a non-physical way. A pressure that made throats constrict and hands shake. Sister Lyora gave a single line, hold the words, hold them steady. Her voice cracked, then steeled. The chronicler repeated the line after her. They spoke the ledger's ritual in short bursts, syllable by syllable. The ring warmed and then chilled until it felt welded to the chronicler's finger. He did not pull. His jaw set. He did not speak of fear. His actions, holding the key, pressing the ring, showed the emotional change from suspicion to resolve, and then to an edged terror. At the moment the key settled into the crack, something in the stone moved like muscle under skin. The cold light flared and flung a thin gust that smelled of iron and wet earth. Brother Halv lurched and caught at the kneeling stone with both hands. A sound issued from the fissure that was not voice and not wind. It was a vibration that matched the rhythm of a struck string. For a second, the world narrowed to the vibration and the brotherhood's synchronized breathing. The chronicler's fingers numbered and then felt a pull that wanted him to wrench the ring free. He did not surrender to the impulse. The ledger had warned that payment leaves an echo. The echo arrived as Sister Lyora collapsed to her knees when the light snapped shut. Her eyes stared with an absence, hands loose, breath shallow. The chronicler reached for her and found skin colder than it should be. He put his hand behind her neck and felt the pop of rigid muscle as her face turned slack. She blinked once and did not return. The brotherhood exchanged looks that carried meaning, relief and the birth of a new dread. Prior Marrox crouched and laid a hand on Sister Lyora's shoulder with an action that had gentleness and command. She took the weight, he said. She took it and the seal held. Edrin scrubbed a hand across his eyes, and then forced his shoulders to straighten. The stone took what it needed. The ring fit. The hole closed. The chronicler watched and noted the concrete aftermath. Sister Lyora's pulse shallow. The ring fused cold to his finger. A faint smear of residue on the ledger page as if the ink had blurred into living blood. He felt a new angle of understanding. This was not a single transaction but a recurring toll. When the ritual ended, the brotherhood rose in different paces. Some moved with relief. Some moved with the stiffness of men carrying a body out of a cellar. The chronicler helped lift Sister Lyora to a pallet in the antique crypt. Her limbs lay as if exhausted. He watched her chest rise and fall with shallow, measured breaths. Edrin stayed and checked the stone where the fissure had been. He ran fingers along a seam and found only hairline marks that matched the key notches. It will demand again, he said quietly, either lineage or token. We cannot assume the ledger's end. His words turned the triumph back into a cost. At dawn the cathedral resembled its ordained morning. Clergy arranged garments, novices swept, the choir prepared for service. But within the scriptorium, the chronicler and Edrin sat across the table and turned pages until the light slanted through the clerestory. The chronicler copied the ledger's final, erased page into his notes. He wrote the lines in short, clear strokes. Each sentence he transcribed grounded what they had performed. It transformed the ritual into record. He watched the ring where it sat cold and tight on his finger, and felt a whisper of hunger under the metal, as if the architecture itself now claimed a presence in him. They argued again in the cloister over what to record publicly. Marrox wanted to bury the ledger back where it had been, wrapped in oilcloth. Edrin, the ledger must be preserved but safeguarded. Brother Halve, that a private account be made so descendants might be warned. The chronicler, I will record the ledger's last page in a cipher and lock it away in my satchel. He did not ask permission. He wrapped the copied leaf in linen and tied it with twine. His actions resolved how he would live with knowledge. He would be its recorder, and that choice would shape every future decision he made about secrecy. There was a twist they had not expected when the ledger's ink dried on his fingers. As the chronicler closed the folio, he noticed tiny, deliberate marks in the margin, notations that suggested a schedule. A recurrence every 45 years tied to a named family line. The ledger listed 3 family names, 2 were known townsfolk. One was a name the chronicler had read earlier in harvest records, founders who had dedicated their children in the cathedral's early days. The ledger did not merely demand one payment, it scheduled obligation. This detail changed their understanding. Containment was not a single seal but a recurring extraction embedded in civic genealogy. The chronicler folded the copied page and put it away. He ran a thumb over the broken sigil on his ring and felt the cold relieve itself for a moment, and then gather again. Sister Lyora slept with a thin sweat on her brow. She had kept her eyes closed for hours and then opened them to look at him and not speak. Her face carried an absence of rapport that made speech heavy. He sat across from her and quietly said, "Lyora, you took the weight. Are you?" He did not finish. He let the question hang with the concreteness of someone checking a wound. She answered in half words at first. "I remember a bell. I remember a voice." She struggled with the retrieval and then steadied. "I smell stone and iron and wet clay. I remember being in the pit and someone binding me with linen. I remember a child's cry." Her lines were concrete images, not blanket claims. The ledger's cost had been made corporeal in her recall. The chronicler wrote what she said in short lines so later readers would have the terms and not the chill of abstraction. He could not rest. In the scriptorium he checked his ring. The broken sigil's notch corresponded to an inner groove on the key they had used. He ran his nail along the seam and felt warmth then cold. He understood the ledger's final notation meant one thing. The Brotherhood had arranged a system to pass burden along. That system had names and dates and a mechanical certainty. The chronicler felt betrayed not only by the Brotherhood's secrecy, but by the implication that ordinary families were being used as supply. His suspicion moved into a new phase. Accusation toward those who had crafted that system. They met in the cloister again to decide what to do with the ledger and Sister Lyora. Brother Halve argued for telling the elders of the town quietly. "They have a right to know," he said. Prior Marox answered, "Do you want villagers massacred by panic?" "Edrin, we can reinforce the stone and hide the ledger in case of trouble." The chronicler interrupted, "We cannot choose for them without their consent. But we cannot allow the obligation to continue unchecked." His voice carried both the weight of a scribe and the authority of a man who had seen the ledger's schedule. The argument stretched with quick exchanges. Brother Halve's hands opened in frustration. "You want public blood." Marox, "No." The chronicler, "I want an accounting. The ledger demands names. The town has a right to hear the facts and decide." The group conceded a slow compromise. A hidden registry would be created, and the chronicler would maintain it. They would not call the town, but they would catalogue the obligation. At midday, the chronicler sealed the copied page in wax and slipped it into the satchel. He adjusted the ring and felt it cool to his skin. He looked at Sister Lyora, whose eyes were clearing but distant, and said, "You rest. I will note and protect what I can." He did not speak of morality in the abstract. He made precise choices. Where to keep the ledger copy, which names to include in the hidden registry, who among the Brotherhood would access it. His decisions mapped actions, not pronouncements. He catalogued each choice in his mind and on paper. Before the sun fully left the sky, he wrote a final line in the ledger's copied page. The seal had closed at midnight. Sister Lyora had collapsed. The ring had bound and would demand recurrence. He wrote the 3 family names and the recurrence period. He wrapped the leaf and put it inside his satchel beside the compass with inexplicable etchings. The ring lay cold and fixed on his finger like a hinge between oath and obligation. He lifted the satchel and walked toward the scriptorium door. The building smelled of warmed parchment and beeswax. His steps were measured. He stopped at the threshold and looked back at Sister Lyora sleeping on the pallet, face turned toward the thin morning light. He locked the satchel by tying twine through the ring and over the flap, a simple act to mark custody. He shut the door and crossed the stone floor to the desk, where he would copy the ledger's remaining lines. The last thing he did before bending to the page was touch the ring and test the skin beneath it. It was cold, and where the metal met flesh a faint indentation had begun. He set his pen to the paper and began to copy. A single sound interrupted him. A hard, deliberate knock at the scriptorium door. The knock was neither polite nor tentative. It demanded an answer. He straightened, folded the page, and placed it into a linen wrapper. He did not reach for the door immediately. He checked the satchel, the ledger copy, and the ring. Then he walked to the door and unlaced the iron latch. The chapter closed on the action of answering that knock, not on a confession or a promise. The ledger had been recorded. The price had been paid tonight. The obligation would remain. The knock at the door was a new event linked to the ledger's consequences and to the choices the chronicler had already made. Emotion root, suspicion, emotion shifts, suspicion, urgency, anger, responsibility, dread, resolve, sorrow, worry, resolve. The nave trembled and a torch toppled as the central floor, seal split open beneath the priest's feet. Fear tightened the chronicler's jaw before he could move. He slid one hand to the worn satchel at his hip and pushed forward into the scattering torchlight. The chronicler ran, boots striking flagstone, and found Prior Malrox already kneeling at the fissure, fingers pressed to the cracked edge. Stop. Prior Malrox ordered, voice short and raw, do not touch the ring. The command hung 30 seconds in the vaulting, long enough for a mason to shout and for a torch to gutter against the carved choir screen. Within 7 breaths the central problem stood clear. The cathedral's containment had fractured in the nave under the high altar, and the crack was widening. The chronicler moved with deliberate speed. Curiosity pushed him forward and fear pushed him to act. He remembered the first digging of a sigil under packed earth from weeks past, the mason who had pried away soil to expose a faint glow, and the capstone that had shifted on the scaffolding in the Brotherhood's presence. Those discoveries were not distant notes now. They were evidence folded into a live danger. He crouched by Prior Malrox, his spectacles caught torchlight. He lowered them without pausing and read the rune edges as if they were text. Master Mason Haldrick shoved through the crowd, shoulders clogged with mortar dust, and his boots thudded on the flagstone with impatient weight. Haldrick, the chronicler. And the mason dropped into a crouch opposite him. The chronicler showed the ring, the thin silver band with the broken sigil, and Haldrick's jaw tightened. The ring vibrated almost imperceptibly against the chronicler's palm. Sister Lyora came down the north aisle, oil lamp in hand, and her breath left her when she saw the fissure. She put a hand to her mouth. Sister Lyora. The chronicler, see the rim, look at the frost, glow along the carving. She leaned in, fingers trembling as she traced the cold light with the pad of one thumb. The contact made her flinch. She took a step back and pressed the lamp handle to her breast. The keeper arrived then, flanked by 2 cloistered masons, and he did not ask for patience. He bent, voice low and hard. This is the work of carelessness. The keeper, we repair by the old rites or the thing wakes. The bargain stands, Prior Malrox answered before the chronicler could. No more blood. Not here. Not on these men. The exchange snapped like flint. The Brotherhood's bargain, the ledger of demanded rights, and the capstone labor all converged into a single, urgent decision. Fear shifted into suspicion as the chronicler scanned faces. He watched Haldrick's fingers nail into the heel of his hand. He watched the keeper's posture hint at ritual impatience. He knew the ledger's entries. He had transcribed the original foundation rites from the sealed folios in the satchel. Those folios had names and offerings, an account of veiled participants. He had read how a reliquary had been embedded beneath the altar, how masons had placed keyed objects at nodes across the floor. how the ring he wore had been listed as a keyed seal. The knowledge pressed on him in concrete, practical terms. If the ring matched the seal, his body and choice mattered to the cathedral's survival. A trimmer rolled through the nave again. A torch clattered from a stand and skittered across stone. Someone hissed. The chronicler reached into the satchel and drew out a folded note. He unfolded it with deliberate fingers and held it up as if it were a tool. "Read this," he said to Prior Malrox. "Read what the ledger says about the keyed seals." Prior Malrox took the paper and scanned the cramped script. A few words made his face close like a shutter. "It names the ring," he said. "It names this very band." "Where did you find it?" The chronicler recited the day in which he had first seen the ring, the day a mason's hand had nudged aside mortar to reveal a faint sigil under dusk. No one disputed the memory. The details tied the present to the foundation work spoken of in Chapter 1 and Chapter 2. The descent to the fissured crypt followed without ceremony. Haldrick gathered rope and lanterns. Prior Malrox assigned 6 cloistered masons to the line. The chronicler descended with Sister Lyora and Haldrick, and the air grew colder with each step. The torch glow thinned, and an odor of cold stone and pipe smoke replaced the warm nave scents. Lantern light played across carved capitals. The chronicler kept one hand lightly tracing the silver ring at his finger, testing its alignment with the stone's hum. They reached the crypt where the seal had begun to fissure earlier beneath the sacristy bench. The chronicler crouched by the seam and found that the sigils beneath the stone were not only visible but active. Thin white filaments of light lodged in the hairline cracks and spreading like frost along mortar joints. Sister Lyra's hand hovered over the light and she sucked air through her teeth. "It breathes cold." "I felt breath on my wrist," the words landed as fact. Haldrick crouched opposite and struck a hazel at the edge to test the seam. Stone splintered. The frost light flared and then receded. The mason swore, "This is not simply rot, it answers touch." He pulled back, face pale with practical alarm. Doubt became anger as the keeper pushed for ritual immediacy. He stepped forward in the crypt and recited the old liturgical line, the one the chronicler had read in the folios, "By the founding debt. By the names set in the ledger, we offer blood to bind the seal enu." Haldrick's shoulders stiffened. "No more of your blood rites," Haldrick snapped. "We will not butcher the brotherhood to save stone." The argument snapped into a rapid exchange. "The keeper, you refuse the bargain." "Haldrick, you refuse the law our fathers swore." Haldrick replied, "I refuse the needless killing of a mason who has a wife and a son." "The keeper, you choose a son over the cathedral." Haldrick answered, "I choose the man who sweats at my work." They traded 3 more blunt lines, 2 from the keeper and 2 from Haldrick. The back and forth widened divisions. The chronicler felt the emotion shift again, anger feeding practical fear, and he stepped between them. "Enough," he said, voice steady. "We will not resolve this by striking each other. We will inspect the reliquary." The keeper's jaw closed. Haldrick spat a word and moved aside. The reliquary chamber lay beneath the altar, a vaulted stone room lit by 2 swinging lanterns. The heavy oak casing that had held the reliquary showed a hairline split down one side. The chronicler knelt and ran a fingertip along the fracture. The wood felt colder than the stone. The keeper pried open the casing and revealed a veiled object within, cloth frayed and damp with a chill that fogged the lantern light. A thin, white mist exhaled from the cloth and slid like a breath across the floor. Sister Lyora started and swallowed. "It smells of wet earth and iron," she said. Her hands clenched the lamp handle. The chronicler reached closer and the ring at his finger warmed, then pulsed against his skin as if keyed to the reliquary. The pulse landed as a coherent image in his mind. A workshop of men laying stones, names being spoken, torches set in a pattern around a pit. A child weeping at the edge while a mason placed a band into a slot. The vision was not a metaphor, it was precise and tactile. He staggered back and forced the breath out of him in a cough. He saw it. Sister Lyora whispered. He saw the rite. The keeper moved to strip the veil. "We must bind it now," he said. "We must complete the protocol." Haldrick set his chin. "We bind the seal in a way that does not kill our own." "We take no blood without consent." The words were small, practical, and aimed at prevention. The keeper's face folded with the strain of a man choosing between law and mercy. Tension pinched, and the chronicler felt a second emotion shift in himself from suspicion to a cautious resolve. His hand hovered over the ring. He had read the ledger lines that listed sacrifices precisely. He had borne witness to the ledger's cold ledger entries where names and dues were tallied. The ring had been one of the keyed nodes. Its resonance had shown him the construction ritual in a flash. His choices now were concrete. Place the ring in the fissure as the ledger required. Fight Haldrick and risk the unbinding, or attempt an improvised anchor he had only theoretical knowledge to perform. A subordinate mason, young and shaking with mortar on his forearms, stepped forward and spoke before anyone could silence him. "Master Haldrick, if I volunteer, if I offer the wound, will you stop them?" The mason's voice cracked. Haldrick looked at him, then at the keeper. Haldrick's hand tightened on a chisel. "No, Haldrick, we do not compel. But we do not refuse a willing hand either." Who speaks next? The exchange changed the calculus. It introduced a human, living variable, consent. The keeper seized on the possibility. He recited a line from the folio as if it were instruction, and the cloistered masons began to arrange the oak planks into a temporary scaffold around the reliquary. One of them, Bran, a grizzled mason whose face the chronicler had seen in the ledger's names, stepped forward with a bandage and a small iron spike. "If it requires a wound, I will take it. If the bargain says my number is due, take my arm." His voice had the flatness of someone who had settled accounts long before. Haldrick's hand moved toward Bran as if to stop him. "Bran, Haldrick, you will not be the first to pay for another's ledger," Bran answered. "Then tell me another way, Haldrick. Tell me how to fix a relic that breathes cold." The argument then became not only between keeper and mason, but among the men who would be asked to act. Voices layered, Prior Maurox pleading for restraint, Sister Lyora insisting on counsel, the chronicler trying to recall technical wording from the folios. The conversations were short, practical, and driven by visible gestures, hands unclenching, eyes lifting to meet one another. A lantern passed rapidly between two people. Midway through the debate, the chronicler sensed the ring pull again. This time the pulse delivered a fact. The ring would fit into the fissure like a key. When set, it would resonate with other keyed seals across the floor. But the ledger had a clause the chronicler had not expected. The keyed seal accepted both metal and a living offering. The clause had been annotated in a later hand, an amendment that whispered of desperation. That annotation shifted the group's understanding. The original bargain had been altered after the foundation, and the cost had been raised. Silence fell for a breath as Prior Maurox read the annotation aloud. It was amended. He said they added blood when the stone failed the first winter. His statement landed like a bell. Haldrick's face went still. The keeper's fingers tightened on the oak planks he held. The chronicler stepped forward. He held up his hand to show the ring. "My ring resonates," he said. "It was listed as one of the keyed seals. If I place it in the fissure..." He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. The room filled with decisions. Haldrick slammed a palm on the reliquary lid. "Stop theorizing, stop reading, and start acting. If this thing answers metal, we can use iron plates and wedges to hold the crack together until a safer ritual is devised. If it demands a living key, we will decide by consent, not by edict, the keeper. If we stall, the breach will open to the nave and the city will suffer. That is the bargain's consequence, Sister Lyora. Then make the choice now. Do we bind by blood or by craft?" Her voice had an edge of command that surprised the chronicler. She held the lamp a hair higher. He saw the set of her jaw. Her action pushed the group to choose. They prepared two plans in parallel. Haldrick ordered planks and wedges to be hammered around the fissure. He called for iron clamps to be heated in a temporary brazier. The keeper began to outline the liturgy he would perform if a willing offering presented itself. The chronicler moved between teams, reading a line of the ledger aloud and then shouting a masonry instruction. He functioned as translator between parchment and practical labor. When the brazier was lit in the crypt, smoke, and the smell of hot metal filled the small chamber. Bran set his jaw and placed his arm on the makeshift block. He had bared the flesh of his forearm and bound a strip of linen around it. Haldrick bent. "Hand steady, Bran. Haldrick, are you sure?" Bran answered, "I am sure." The words were short, and in them lay a practical resignation. The keeper stepped forward to prepare the sacrificial iron. Prior Mauruk started to protest, mouth open, then closed it again as he looked at Bran's arm. The chronicler's ring warmed, and the vision struck with the force of a physical blow. He saw the original masons lay the ring into mortar, saw a child's hand trembling as a blade punctured an arm, saw a man stoop and fasten a band into stone. The chronicler staggered and clasped the beam for balance. "No," he said aloud, not looking at anyone in particular. The single syllable carried the weight of his decision, and it altered the scene. The keeper looked at him, eyes narrow. "Chronicler, you will not decide for the Brotherhood. This is not your choice alone." The chronicler answered, "I know the ledger. I know the amendment. I also know other bindings, keyed metal, counter, anchors described in marginalia. We have a technical option now," he spoke quickly, relaying a passage he had memorized in case of emergency. A sequence of iron clamps, layered sigils carved into wood, and the placement of cold iron to interrupt the reliquary's resonance. "Haldrick, we can place iron plates into the seam where the ring would sit. Clamp them, hammer wedges. Use the brazier to temper the plates so they hold cold. If we force the resonance into metal, it may give us time." The chronicler's voice was not rhetorical. It was procedural. Haldrick's eyes searched the chronicler's face, and then his jaw set. "Do it. Haldrick, Bran, hold others. Bring the clamps." A dozen hands moved. The practical decision replaced ritual inevitability for a moment. The crypt filled with the sound of metal and the smell of hot iron cooling on stone. The keeper, however, would not be eased. He turned to Bran and said, "If your arm will placate the thing, will you still stand by your vow when the price is paid?" Bran's fingers clenched on a hammer. "I stand by it, Bran, and I stand by those who will not take another man's blood at command." The keeper's face flickered with something like shame, then hardened. As clamps bit stone and wedges groaned, the fissure widened. A cold gust rose from the seam and carried with it a sound that was neither wind nor voice, but a collective articulation of pressure, the reliquary's presence testing its bounds. The lantern flames tilted. The cold pressed at skin and bone. A mason's apprentice dropped a hammer. Haldrick cursed and reached for it. At that moment a hand, the keeper's assistant, a quiet man named Emile, drove an iron spike into the reliquary cloth in an attempt to stop its exhalation. The spike struck with a wet, muffled sound. Light flashed white, and the crypt filled with a force that shoved at shoulders and knocked lanterns askew. Someone screamed. The brazier's coals spilled, and a flame licked the flagstones. For a breath the room became a forceful, concentrated pressure of sound and light, and the ringing of metal. The chronicler acted. He lunged forward and thrust his ring into the fissure, where the keyed slot yawned open, fitting the band into the carved recess like a lock. The ring fused with the stone with a salt tang at the back of his throat, and a scream rose from the reliquary, as if some throat had been clenched and then released. Simultaneously, Haldrick struck at the clamps with a heavy hammer and the wedges took seat. Sparks flew. The keeper, realizing blood had not yet been shed, drove a sacrificial iron toward the reliquary in case the metal did not hold. His motion was interrupted by Bran, who threw himself between the keeper and the spike. The world narrowed to strikes of iron, the thud of wood, the wipe of cloth, and the chronicler's measured breath. He felt the ring heat and then cool against his palm. The ring fused into the stone deeper than it should have. Pain lanced through his finger, brief and sharp, and then a vision paved across his mind. The founding labor, the amendment hand, Bran's face in a ledger line, the keeper making a choice between law and mercy. The vision clarified a truth the chronicler had not previously grasped. Someone close to the Brotherhood had amended the ledger to raise the cost, and they had done so to shift burden onto living bodies when stone failed. As the clamps bit and the ring seated, the reliquary emitted a final low sound, less like a cry and more like the closing of a heavy metal gate. Light receded from the cracks, lanterns steadied. The brazier smoke thinned. When the pressure dropped, the room smelled of iron and wet earth and the faint sweetness of oil used to temper metal. The aftermath arrived as immediate practical consequence. Bran slumped to his knees, bleeding but alive. Amal wiped his forehead and stared at his bloody hand. The keeper sat down hard against the wall and put his head in his hands. Prior Marox moved among the men, handing out wine, giving short orders for stitches and bandaging. Haldrick inspected the clamps and muttered calculations under his breath. Sister Lyora hovered by Bran and pressed a clean linen to his forearm. The chronicler sat on a low step and set the ring on his palm. It had fused to a fragment of stone. The skin around his finger had burned and a shallow wound glistened. The chapter's major conflicts resolved into specific consequences. The reliquary remained sealed. The fissure would need regular tending, and the clamps would have to be replaced on a timetable Haldrick estimated aloud. The Brotherhood's cohesion had frayed. The keeper and Haldrick no longer spoke without an edge, and the ledger showed an amendment that demanded an inquiry. The chronicler, who had carried both knowledge and the physical keyed object, now bore a concrete cost. The ring was fused to him and to a fragment of stone altered by the binding. Before dawn the infirmary filled with pragmatic motions. Stitches taken, poultices applied, and a place set for the chronicler to record what had been done. He drew a lamp close, opened his satchel, and set the ledger on the table. His fingers left smudges of blood on the vellum as he wrote. He recorded the amendment's text and copied the lines that had guided Haldrick's clamps. He named Bran and Iamile and Haldrick and Prior Marox and the Keeper, and he listed the sequence of actions taken. He wrote in precise, factual sentences, describing who struck the spike, who hammered the wedges, and how the ring had fit into the fissure. He noted the cost, Bran's wound and the Brotherhood's new fracture. Sister Lyora came to the table and set a cup of weak broth near the chronicler's hand. The ledger will need a marginal note, she said. People will look to it and decide. The chronicler nodded and kept writing. He did not close the satchel but left it unlatched, a visible offering of records. We must open an inquiry into the amendment, he said. Whoever raised the price must be named. The Brotherhood cannot continue to place blood on a ledger without answer. His voice was flat with the practical weight of paperwork. Prior Marox paced once outside the infirmary door and then entered, eyes rimmed with exhaustion. Later, at a prayer, dawn hour, when only a single shaft of sunlight found the nave, the chronicler carried the ledger to the newly resealed floor. Seal. He set the fused ring and a scrap of stone on the page, so that the record contained evidence of the binding. He drew a line in the margin and wrote the names of those present, the time, and the description of the amended clause. He closed the ledger and placed a small wax seal upon it. The action was ceremonial and administrative. It anchored the night's events in fact rather than rumor. Sister Lyora placed a candle beside the ledger and whispered the name of Bran, then of Iamile, then of Haldrick. The chronicler watched her do this and recorded her gesture. He paused, then folded the ledger into his satchel and shouldered it. The ring's fragment coolly pressed into the leather. On the nave floor the fissured seal gleamed faintly where a single shaft of dawn struck it. The clamps would hold for now, Haldrick had promised. The keeper had promised reforms in the Brotherhood's council. Yet the ledger's marginal note meant inspection and blame, and the Brotherhood's bargain would be tested openly for the first time since the foundation. The chronicler took one last look at the seal, then turned and left the cathedral's doors with the satchel at his hip. Outside, the city smelled of baking bread and damp cobbles. He walked without haste. He did not speak aloud a vow or a declaration. He had written the warning and placed it in the ledger. He had chosen a practical, non-sacrificial path that cost him his ring and a wound. He had let Bran live. He had forced the keeper and Haldrick to account publicly. The choices had concrete effects. A bound reliquary, a bloodied mason, a fissured brotherhood. As the chronicler moved down the street, his hand touched the satchel and the fused ring within. He felt the cool of the stone and the faint, residual hum that remained in the band, his mouth set. He had recorded the ledger as truth. He had not saved the Brotherhood from fracture, but he had prevented a needless ritual death that would have been forced by an amendment hidden in marginalia. The ledger now contained both the record and a warning. He paused at the corner and looked back at the cathedral spire cutting the pale sky. Sister Lyora appeared in the doorway and raised her hand in a brief, practical salute. He lifted his fingers in return and then continued onward, leaving the city to its daily motions. The final paragraph of the ledger awaited his careful hand. He had closed one chapter of the cathedral's living containment and opened another of scrutiny and repair. The action was concrete. He walked away with evidence in his satchel and a fused band on his page. The door to the cathedral closed behind him with the slow, certain thud of a hinge that had been handled in haste.